Come get your victory at the table. Let's talk. Let's talk. Come get your victory at the table. Let's talk. Let's talk.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on whatever time you have decided to tune in with us. We would like to welcome you to another episode of Victory at the Table Talk, where we have down-to-earth conversations about various topics to assist with your walk with Christ. Here at the table, you can get the victory, but you can also get a taste of Victory Apostolic Church right here in Matson, Illinois, where we are building victorious Christ-like lives. Enjoy this episode.
Welcome to another episode of Victory at the Table Talk, the Gospel of Justice edition. I am Reverend Bryant Warren, and I am the CEO of the Gospel of Justice Ministry of Victory Apostolic Church, and I will be your host today of our very special Social Justice podcast. On today, we will have a very serious conversation: racial trauma, stress, and youth mental health. And joining me today for this very important conversation, to my left, I have Ms. Hanifah Ross. She is the Dean of Students at Thornton School District 205. Thank you for being here with us today.
Hello, and thank you very much for having me.
And on my right, we have Edith Crigler. She is a social work field instructor at the University of Chicago School of Social Service Administration, and she is at Chicago State University Social Work Department, and she is a member of the Illinois Prisoner Review Board. Did I get all those right? I'm sure there's probably more.
Sure did, Brian, and thanks so much for inviting me here. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Well, thank you very much. So I want everyone to know that today's podcast is a collaborative effort with the Gospel Justice Ministry and with JSIC Charitable Foundation, which is a South Suburban nonprofit organization whose mission is to promote cultural, educational, economic, and health awareness programming for youth by empowering our community. So they help to arrange the guests here. We've had some great conversation, and we're glad to have you here to continue the conversation. Yeah. So I want to start here. We've had a lot of conversations about racial trauma, and I still consider myself to be a young man, though numerically that maybe that's not true. But when we talk about racial trauma, what does that mean? What does it mean to have racial trauma? I know what it means to be traumatized in a car accident, but what is racial trauma?
Well, Brian, we were talking earlier about it. I believe this trauma goes all the way back to the Middle Passage. When we acknowledge our ancestors and those that were able to survive the Middle Passage, they survived slavery. They came through Reconstruction. They survived Jim Crow. Jim Crow.
Got it.
And then the civil rights. And now here we are in the year 2000 and all the trauma we're experiencing because of social media and what's going on around the world. We live in a very violent world. But what people have to realize is that comes down through generations, and it's part of our DNA as Black people. Black people in diaspora who are still fighting for equal rights and for justice, and to be acknowledged as human beings and not as animals or savages. And so that trauma is part of who we are as a people, and we have to acknowledge it in order to teach our children how to deal with the trauma they're experiencing today.
How do we deal with that? I mean, you are a practitioner. You're dealing with students every day in District 205. Are you seeing any evidence of this racial trauma with the students that you work with?
Oh, absolutely. We have very open conversations. Although we have been remote this school year, we have had a variety of platforms in our district with the support staff members, the social workers, the counselors, and we've had opportunities where students can share their feelings and their responses, and they're definitely scared. They're frustrated. You know, their anxiety has increased significantly, not just from the pandemic, but from seeing how African Americans, people of color, are being treated, and then attempting to rationalize how that could possibly impact them, going out into the world. And then also, a number of my students have had negative interactions, at the hands of police officers, et cetera. And so there's that conversation of how do you best support them, with that. But yes, there's definitely an impact. There's no doubt about that.
So there's an impact. I'm not a teacher. I don't have your expertise, but I have a 16-year-old daughter who is going into her junior year of high school. What are some things that I or other parents should be looking for to identify some of these if she's been racially traumatized?
I think it's very important to give young people their voice, or to help them find their voice. So many of the youth that I see, because not only do I interact with adults who are incarcerated in the Illinois Department of Corrections, but I also interact with the youth that are in the Illinois Department of Juvenile Justice. And one of the things I sit down and I let these young people know is that a lot of them are extremely, extremely angry. And they're angry because of the trauma they've experienced, first and foremost, from their family of origin, and then living in some of the communities that are very broken and fragile, and then coming into a system that is not for children, and especially not for Black children. They changed the name, but it's still prison. And what I do is that I let the children talk to me. I listen, and I think as adults, we have to really allow children to speak their mind and to say what they say. I know once we were doing a circle with a bunch of young children, because I'm also a restorative justice practitioner, and one little boy was just using language that was so offensive to me as an adult and as a senior and as a woman. And but in the circle, you don't interrupt anybody. And at the end of the circle, I learned so much from this kid, because this is his only way to express himself. And what he was saying was so profound. And it really taught me is that I had to develop a thicker coat and be able to let young people be who they are, and then give them the opportunity to say, now we can find better words for this. So I think that as parents and as adults, you have to allow young people to talk to you, no matter how they talk to you, to be able to express themselves.
That is stirring up a big hornet nest within the Black community. Black kids are meant to be seen and not heard.
Well,
so that is really countercultural to what is our tradition, but it sounds like it's something that we need to do. But so how do we move past our culture that tells us to be quiet? And part of it goes back to what we talked about earlier. Part of it is that we're teaching our kids to be quiet because we had to protect them. They had to learn that there are certain places that you can't talk. You have to talk to people a certain type of way because you get yourself in trouble. What do you have there, Hanifah?
Well, we spoke earlier about my role at the Peace Center, and the Peace Center is the alternative school program for District 205, meaning that students who were in the traditional environment of Thornwood, Thornton, or Thorn Ridge and exhibited unwanted behaviors that were deemed make them eligible for expulsion, right? They were sent to the alternative school program. When we went over there to transform it or to do things differently, that's one of the things that we changed, and we were very specific about the usage of language and the way that they communicate. So yes, I'm in complete agreement with Edie with letting them speak how they speak, meeting them where they are, right?
Okay.
But I'm also a proponent of equipping them with the skills that are going to permit them to be successful in the world. And so at the Peace Center, we have adopted the Boys Town social skills. It's kind of like we talked earlier. If I go into your home, I need to know how to, you have to orient me to your home, right? Mm-hmm. And so at the Peace Center, they come in and we have interviews and we have an orientation and we explain to them our social norms, right? So you may have been accustomed to communicating like this in your world, and I'm not going to negate that. I'm not going to in any way see it in I'm not going to negate. I'm not going to see it in a negative light. But at the same time, I'm going to equip you with the skills to be able to be upset, to be frustrated, and then to have different language that would allow you to communicate with me effectively and be heard. Because if you're cursing me out, or if you're cursing somebody out in the real world, they may not necessarily hear your message because they're going to be so offended. And so there's a space for all of that. But yeah.
Well, I don't think this young man wasn't cursing me out. He was just using the language, and this is how he communicates. And I allowed him to tell his story. I think it's so important to allow children to tell their story in any way they can get it out, because it's cathartic.
Absolutely.
And once they get it out, and then as an adult, you have a time later where you can go back and you said, I really heard what you said, but next time, why don't we try this? And you end up giving them different words to do it.
Absolutely. Okay.
But your question was, what do? We need to let children speak to us in whatever language in any way they can, so they can get their stories out. Because I know their stories are much different from mine. Mm-hmm. I'm older than anybody else in this room. And I know when I was a young person, my life was so much freer at 15, 16, and 17 years old than these children's lives are now. I have a 17-year-old living with me who doesn't even like to drive at nighttime anymore because he doesn't want to have a negative encounter with anybody. So he has chosen to kind of make sure he's in at a certain hour. And he's getting ready to go off to college, but he has his own protective factors that he has developed to protect himself. And I think as adults and parents, you have to help young people develop their own protective factors in order to make them be able to survive and know that this world doesn't really like you. And the first thing they're going to see when you go into any room is that you're a black man or a black woman before you ever open your mouth. And that is something that is real. And so when you open your mouth, you have to speak with authority and respect to people so that they will respect you and they will be able to hear whatever your story is.
Absolutely.
So when I was a kid, probably my first introduction that there was an issue of race was in the 70s when Roots first came out. And I can remember my parents and everybody gathered in the room to watch Roots, and they told all the kids, they shut the door. The kids weren't allowed to watch it. I don't think I saw Roots until I was older. Wow. But kids, my daughter has a cell phone. Ooh. She's able to watch the murder of George Floyd, or watch Laquan McDonald be shot 16 times, or Dante Wright accidentally shot when he was supposed to be using a taser. How do we have and help our kids process what it is that they're seeing on social media regarding race?
I haven't the slightest idea how to answer that question, but to say that my introduction to race was at the knee of my grandfather, who was a Pullman porter, and I had to be 9 or 10 years old, who told me why he left Arkansas. And he told me he left Arkansas because he had 3 sons, and he didn't want the night riders, this is what he called them, to come in and take his sons. So he migrated to Chicago, and he brought his daughters and his sons here. And he told me then, and I didn't understand it then, he said to me, he said, baby, I want you to know this is in the 50s now. I'm dating myself. He said, there are 2 free black people in this world. No, he said, there are 2 free people in the world. That's the white man and the black woman. And his reason was that the black woman could go places her black man could not go, and that she could say things that he could not say. And I didn't understand it until I got to be a woman. And I was out with my husband, and we were in a store buying a major product, and there was a white salesman, and he addressed me and not my husband.
Wow.
And I realized for the first time what the lesson my grandfather told me when I was 10 years old, and I had to be in my 20s then. And I realized that he was so true, and this has been going on since the beginning of time. We as black women have always been able to make certain entries into society that our men couldn't make. And so this whole notion of knowing where we came from, Sankofa, you got to know where you came from to know where you're going. So it's really important that we tell our children that they stand on the shoulders of some very strong people. You know, we wouldn't be at this table talking today if our ancestors hadn't survived all that trauma they did.
Absolutely.
So we are duty bound to tell these children the truth of whose they are and where they came from. And if those people can survive that, they can survive everything they're seeing now. Because they saw lynchings, they saw burnings, they saw people get castrated, they saw women being raped. This is what our ancestors saw. So now our children are seeing this thing, and they're kind of living in a kind of sanitized world. Because here we are out here in South Suburban Illinois, and we're in Matson, we're in this beautiful, beautiful church. And we have arrived, in the estimate of some people, you know. But there's still a lot of trauma going on, and we have to be real, and we have to be honest with our children, and we just sit down and talk to them. We talk about trauma. I think everybody in the world was trauma. Every time I see that thing that happened to George Floyd, I cry. It's just, it takes my breath away. So I can imagine what a young black boy, young girl is thinking when they're going out into the world, getting ready to go to college and try to go get a job and have to maneuver. Is that going? Am I going to be next?
And I think that's very appropriately worded. You began saying you didn't know, but you then came to give us phenomenal answers.
Right.
You know, talking to the children about some of the negative, treacherous parts of our history will also equip them, you know, as she stated, and letting them know that, you know, those before you have made it. And so it's inside you to be strong. You have what you need inside you, you know, and just draw from the perseverance, the resilience, you know, and then just being that person for them, letting them know that when they are uneasy and upset, they can come to you and speak to you. But teaching them their history and teaching them the history before the slavery. You know, we come from greatness.
Correct. I think that's really important to talk about that strength. We talk about the trauma and the atrocities that we've gone through, but the strength and the endurance and the perseverance and that God was with us in order to make it. That is a part of our history.
And continues to be with
Just as kids are excited because their dad was a boxer or a basketball player, they should be able to talk about that their grandparents, great-grandparents survived the Middle Passage, and we've inherited that strength and that endurance as well. So I think that's profound.
You know, I told my grandchildren, I don't know if any of you all saw it, the movie, A Man Called George, and it was all about the Pullman porters.
Yes.
And what they went through. And I have made sure that all of my grandchildren know that that's what my grandfather was. He was one of those George guys, you know, that the folks that brought the Defender to the South. I mean, he was a trooper in his day. He knew A. Philip Randolph because he helped organize the Brotherhood. I mean, and so this is a history that we have to tell our children. I have made it a point to do things through Ancestry. And just the other day, I found out that my great-grandfather, who was a preacher, and he was from Mississippi, and he went to Oklahoma, and he got hooked up with a African from Ghana, Chief Smith. And he and Chief Smith, and I can't think of the other man's name, all worked and got money from black churches and bought a boat to go back to Libya. And I found on Ancestry, I found his passport, I found his picture, and I was really searching, and just the other day I found out that he was on a train one day and he had to jump off because the Klan was coming after him, and he jumped off the train and hid in a ditch. And the sheriff came to get him out, and when the sheriff came to get him, he thought he was one of the Klan,
Right.
and he ended up beating the sheriff up.
Oh, no.
And the sheriff didn't arrest him because he knew he was afraid and he was trying to get away, and that he didn't know who this white man who had come to get him. And I have all this documented that I can show to my grandchildren. So it's important that we tell these stories. They talk about the griot and the oral history. We have to tell our history, and we can't say, no, this is kids. kids should be seen and not heard. I don't believe that. I believe that children should be in the room where we're having these hard conversations and know that it isn't easy for us to have them with them, and empower them to be able to say how they feel about it. And it may make them uncomfortable.
Sure.
But we have to be able to have those hard conversations. And I don't believe in pushing children aside and saying they should be seen and not heard.
Absolutely. I agree. So let's look at another side of this. So a couple of months ago, we had with us Commander Keith Taylor, first black police officer who attained the rank of sergeant and then commander in Flossmoor, which is a prominent middle-class community here in the south suburbs of Chicago. And he was very honest to talk about the issues within law enforcement. But he also talked about the issue of, at times, pulling over black kids, our children, and them not understanding and respecting police officers, reaching under their seats, being disrespectful towards him, though he's trying to be respectful. How do we have these conversations about how to interact, how our students should or our kids should interact with law enforcement?
You know, I had the fortunate privilege of learning about a program that was called Bridging the Divide. It was a partnership with the YMCA and the Chicago Police Department, in which it provides questions where it facilitates conversations between community members, police officers, and youth. And the first thing, we utilized the restorative practices of a peace circle. And we had circles where the police came in and they had conversations with the youth, and they were able to see the youth as a person. They were able to see the youth as people, and the youth were able to see the police officers as people. And Edie and I had this conversation prior in the green room because I'm the daughter of a Chicago police officer. Okay. And I also grew up in what is now Bronzeville, but was before the hood because it was across the street from Stateway Projects and Robert Taylor Project homes. But the first part is to teach them that the respect, needs to come in. And it's a matter of life and death, right? This is not something that you play with. And it's very difficult when students have had negative experiences because our perception is our reality. And so if I've been mistreated or my family member has been mistreated, I'm looking at you as the representative of all the police officers who have done something wrong, right? I'm looking at you as the representative of that. But to teach the students to be respectful, respect first, teaching them their rights. What do you have? What can an officer ask you? What are you obligated to tell them? What are you not obligated to tell them? So educating them on the rights, encouraging them to be respectful, and then having those sit down peace circles or conversational opportunities where they're able to just get to know those police officers and get to know police officers, period.
Okay.
You're so right. I know about Bridging the Divide. Believe it or not, I started something called Kids and Cops before Bridging the Divide. I was working for the Chicago Area Project, and I was running a program called Youth as Resources, where you look at youth as a resource and not as a problem. And the young people were coming in telling me and my staff about all their negative encounters. And like you, Hanifah, I am the wife of a retired, now deceased police officer, and I'm the mother of a Chicago police sergeant, the niece of a police sergeant. So I come from a strong police family. And I decided to ask the kids, I said, would you like to sit down and talk to police? And they said, yes, but we don't want the police to come in uniform.
In uniform. Ooh, that's huge.
They don't want them to bring their guns. So I was working with police officers in the 7th District and the 4th District. And I went there and I talked to the commander, and he hooked me up with a nice young officer in 7th called Officer Yancey, who was Latino, and one in the 4th District. And I talked to them, and they brought police officers to our center, and the kids sat down in circle because I'm a restorative justice. And I wanted them to know that these are men who are somebody's fathers,
absolutely,
brothers, uncles, cousins, and when they take off the uniform, they're just like you are. And then I ended up leaving CAP, and Vanessa Wesley, who was she had been to some of those things, then she came up with Bridging the Divide. And I mean, I think they have just done absolutely phenomenal. But to answer your question, the answer is to have these conversations in circle because circles allow people to tell their stories in a way where nobody can interrupt when you have the talking piece. And that way, the young people can hear the stories of the police and get to know them as human beings. What did they say in that picture, Avatar? I see you. Mm-hmm. And to really begin to see them. And the police can hear the children's story and understand why they're so resentful. And if you begin to have these community kind of conversations, you will be amazed at how it kind of shifts things. Because just to think that in all the years that I've been around police, I never thought I would see police officers be willing to sit down and have this kind of conversation. Because I worked at the training academy at one time in my life, and I saw how they train them. It is a paramilitary training. Mm-hmm. And you have to begin to have the conversation and keep on humanizing people so they can understand and they can have a different respect. For that's the way we do it. We end up having our young people sit down because some of them may want to be law enforcement. We can change this whole law enforcement paradigm. I think what we need to have in every community, and I found this when I went to South Africa. I went to South Africa on a restorative justice pilgrimage. And we went there 14 years after apartheid. We went into the townships. And in each township, there is a community group that works with the police. And when there are issues in that community, the community group are the ones that sit in circle with the community and with the police to resolve it. So let's say that there is a dispute between two families. Rather than call the police and have them arrest them, we're going to call the police and we're going to sit down and we're going to mediate this in a restorative justice practice. Mm-hmm. This will work if we do that kind of thing here in the United States. And that's what Bridging the Divide was attempting to do. Mm-hmm. But because we live in Chicago, and it's a political city, and now we have a new mayor, they have a new mayor, and they have a new superintendent. Mm-hmm. Bridging the Divide isn't the way it originally was because it's a new sheriff in town and he does things his way. But if you can allow the community to hold it, no matter who the sheriff is, the community can say, no, we don't do it that way. We do it this way. Gotcha. And this is the way we want to do it. And that's the answer.
I wholeheartedly agree. And I think there also is a place where we acknowledge some of the practices of the system. Like, we acknowledge that. Like, no, don't minimize it, be honest with our students because they can see it. They see it every day. So acknowledging some of the parts of that system that aren't so good, some of the behaviors, that paramilitary training that exists, the mindsets of the people who take the job, although we're going to work and we're going to get to see these officers in front of us, understanding that there is a system in place and what do you need to do to navigate that system to walk away from an incident.
I appreciate that. So as we
let me just say one other thing too. Go ahead. What the community has to know is that those police officers that go out every day and put on those uniforms and have that gun, they're just afraid of the community as the community is of them.
Absolutely.
And that's what we have to acknowledge.
Yes.
And I think that's why we're seeing so many of these things because the police aren't even acknowledging their fear. And they have to be able to have a place to come and have that discussion, about the trauma they experience. And I know they experience trauma because I know my husband did.
Sure.
I know my son does, And when they come home, they need to have a place where they can come and they can dump that trauma and they can heal from it.
Right. And
it takes a village. It takes all of us to begin to do that. But we do have to realize that the police are just afraid of the community as the community is of them.
Okay. And I appreciate that last word, but we're going to give you one more, a minute apiece. I want a message of hope. When it comes to racial trauma, the work that you're seeing, I'm sure you're doing this work because you see a glimmer of hope. In 60 seconds or less, what is that message of hope? Whenever you're ready, share it with us.
For me, the message of hope is humanity and the storytelling and the respect. And as long as I am willing to listen to your story and you're willing to listen to my story, and I acknowledge your humanity and you acknowledge mine, we can build a world.
Awesome. That is beautiful. Beautiful. What you got for us, Hanifah? Take us on out. Shut it down.
The glimmer of hope is that the light will always replace the darkness. It would always come through. The glimmer of hope is that people do not get up in the morning, officers do not get up in the morning with this desire to terrorize. There is good inside of everyone, and there's God, whatever you believe your higher being is, and our actions touching other hearts, touching other souls, things can change, and it changes with us. We change the world by touching and changing the people that we see every day.
That's awesome. Ladies, thank you for being with me today. This has been
Thank
a
you.
great conversation, and I look forward to having you back again. And that concludes our this episode of Victory at the Table Talk. I want to thank Hanifah Ross and Edith Crigler for being here with us today, as we have talked about racial trauma and the stress on our young people. But I want to thank you all for being here. I want you to have a great and victorious day, and we pray God's blessings on you and your household.
Amen.
Yes,
God
thank you for
bless.
having me.
Thank you.
Get your victory.